Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global events through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Bet-El. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. And yes, we are on YouTube. And above all, welcome back after our summer break. Yes, we took a summer break, but the world didn't. The wars in Gaza and Ukraine only worsened, as did those in Sudan and Burma. Yes, Burma, where a vile civil war has been ongoing since 2021. The global financial turmoil increased, if possible, due to the Trump tariffs. Russia was brought out of isolation, courtesy of Trump's invitation to Alaska for a meeting that produced nothing but hubris for Russia. India was forced away from the West due to the 50% Trump tariffs imposed. And China has announced global leadership, backed up by a massive military parade in the presence of a variety of world leaders, including said Putin. Having said all that, if a reality remains stark and biting, it's that it is now exactly 4 years since the Taliban returned to rule Afghanistan. 4 years since the women of Afghanistan have been denied any rights and have been slowly but surely horrendously covered up, literally, and denied any ability to lead their lives. This is probably most clear from the pictures of the horrendous earthquake which hit Afghanistan this week, in which you see no women whatsoever, only men. To discuss the shape of the world and to help us back into our new season, we are delighted to welcome back Jodi Rudoren, Editorial Director of Newsletters at the New York Times, but formerly, when we knew her, she was the editor of The Forward. Hi, and lovely to see you, Jodi.
Great to see you, Ilana, although I must say that introduction is heavy.
And I just did the tip of everything going on, huh? Let's face it. Let's start from the easy thing. You moved to the New York Times from The Forward. What is your new job?
Well, first of all, I'm coming back to the New York Times, where I spent 21 years and really the bulk of my career, and I'd left to run The Forward, the largest Jewish news outlet in the U.S., and it was a really interesting and intense 5.5 years there. And then I did come back here this spring in April. I'm in charge of our newsletter portfolio, which includes The Morning, which is the largest newsletter in the world. 17 million people get it every day, and it's a guide through the news that people really love. And also, we have more than 100 newsletters on different storylines, subject areas. So please sign up at newyorktimes.com/newsletters. And I'm a big fan of newsletters as a form. As editor of The Forward, I wrote one every week. And it was really a great way to just connect directly with readers. I really love that about newsletters. And so it's been really fun to be back at the New York Times, which really is my kind of journalistic home, and doing something new.
Sounds like good fun. Have you read all 100 newsletters?
No comment. My daughter did suggest that I set up a new email address that would only just get all the newsletters. And I did do that. And when I look at that inbox, it's a little bit daunting, I must say.
Okay, better you than I when it comes to those. I just do 4 or 5 newsletters of a morning that come to me from various publications, including the New York Times. And by the time you're through those, even if you just skim them, it's quite a lot of time. So 100 would be,
It's a lot.
as they say in French, un peu juste. Jodi, what's it like living in the US now? People looking from the outside find it very confusing.
I mean, I think that the easiest way to answer, I mean, it is there's just so much to sort of take in every day. And it's just been the pace of news has been really, really intense for the last since Trump returned to office. And I think, I mean, our lead of the morning this morning is about analyzing and sort of zooming out to look at President Trump's use of emergency powers and declarations of emergency. And it takes both a legal look at that and how it compares to other countries, which is really interesting. But I think the thing that landed with me most sort of viscerally was the more psychic issue around emergencies. And it's clear that President Trump uses the idea of an emergency kind of as his like modus operandi, right? Everything is a crisis, everything is emergent. Things are moving very, very fast. We saw this from day one with all the issuance of so many executive orders. And I think there has been a sort of a hyped up of everything that can be really, really overwhelming and literally just hard to track. And it's funny as a journalist and particularly in this role I'm in now where we're sort of like curating the news for people is one of the main things that newsletters do here is to just try to like have that overview and think like, how is today different from yesterday? How are these 5 or 7 or 17 storylines? Like, how do they, which is the most important? Which is the most urgent? What are people most interested in? There's just so much happening. So I think a lot of people in the US are feeling like there's just a hyped up, amped up sense to our news cycle and our politics right now.
I was just thinking as you were talking, apart from being interested in what you said, that actually we spoke exactly a year ago. You started out our post-summer session last year too.
Yeah, right. It was right after the Democratic convention and
Exactly. And you were a lot more hopeful then. Did you have any inkling at all that what would happen happened and the consequences of it?
well, before I answer that question, I just want to say as I finished my answer about the intensity, I was thinking about the other big thing of what it's like to live in the US right now, which is that we are such a divided country. This sense of polarization and of living in two separate spheres. I mean, yesterday there were these two different news stories around vaccines. Florida deciding to end all vaccine mandates, and 3 other states deciding to up them. And it's like, I think we just increasingly feel like whether it's state by state on things like abortion or trans rights, or whether it's more about like what media bubble you live in. But I think the sort of MAGA world and anti-MAGA world feel like two countries a lot of the time. And this is something that I really believe that is death for democracy, and that we really need to find ways to talk across those divides, and that media needs to be a bridge across those divides. And so I think that is the other big animating factor to life here right now. So then I guess to circle back to your question of like, did I have any inkling? I mean, I think, I mean, certainly, I don't remember that much about our conversation, but certainly it always seemed extremely possible that Trump would get elected in 2024. And so I don't think that was a surprise. I mean, it was always sort of a 50-50 toss up, right? But I do think that the way he has governed in his second term, which from the feverishness of the pace to the appointments, the sort of types of people he appointed to cabinet positions, and maybe thirdly, the way he's conducted himself in terms of what he says, where and when, is really starkly different from his first term. And so I don't think that or really many people had an inkling about just how different that would be. Although I will say, I mean, reporters at the Times, Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan, did a series in 2024 about like what the Trump 2.0 could look like. And many of those things have come true. But I feel like the movie Spinal Tap had a re-release or something this summer. And in the preview of it, they, show that famous scene where they talk about the stereo going to 11, and that's the thing, that it feels like everything's on 11. And that's the thing we didn't anticipate, is what that would be like.
And do people in the US, do you think, have a sense of how this is affecting the rest of the world, both in terms of the actual effects, whether it's tariffs or geopolitical decisions, but also the perception of the US is no longer a reliable.
That's a great question. And I'll turn it back to you to ask a little bit about how those things are playing out. I mean, I would say by and large, people in the US know less and care less about the world than we should, because of being a superpower and being big. I think there's, in the anti-Trump world, There is definitely concern about the way that the way U.S. is perceived based on Trump. I would also say in that, again, same kind of apocalyptic anti-Trump world, there's a decent number of people talking about, if not actually moving abroad. So there's some thoughtfulness about it in those circles. I guess the question I have is a little bit, it feels like there's two dynamics, right? There's one of like literally how do the tariffs and other policies, the way Trump feels about NATO, the way Trump's approaching the wars, how do those things affect other people in other countries and affect their perception of us? But also, I think the other big question, right, is the world has how many places in the world are changing in ways that are echoing or similar to what's happening in the US in terms of both the rise of an authoritarian right and also the polarization. I mean, I feel like many countries are also experiencing this kind of tale of two countries kind of split screen reality.
Well, I think on that latter point, you're absolutely right. That polarization, when you mentioned it, it was like, hello, come and join the club. You know, lots of us have been there for a very long time. You go country by country in the countries in which you're allowed to discuss these things, of course, you know, sort of authoritarian places. Nobody even gets to discuss them. But, you know, in what is democracies, the Western world, developed world, polarization has been a reality for a very long time. It's not, that part isn't new. I think that maybe from your answer, it should become apparent that the potentially bigger problem is that the US, it's not a question that, you know, sort of you present it in a kind of mild default. The reality is it's beginning to be perceived as unreliable. And more than that, as actively withdrawing. So all of these acts that Trump is apparently doing to make America great again, in effect, are diminishing America's world leadership position. It is a very weird period to observe the US from the outside, because if you withdraw from science, which is in effect what's happening in many cases, because alongside the antipathy or the whatever to vaccines, he's actively closing down. I mean, I know lots of scientists who don't know if they're going to get their funding.
Right.
So, you know, it's a withdrawal from science. It's a withdrawal from academia because of all the arguments with universities. It's a withdrawal from world leadership in, you know, the UN. It's a withdrawal, you know, sort of from NATO. It's withdrawal, you know, you're pushing India towards China. You know, you impose 50% tariffs. The perception that the accumulative effect of these and many more steps is that actually America is taking a step back. It's not
Yeah.
interested in leading the world anymore.
And you know, I think that Trump is in many ways clear about that, right? I mean, there's a clear isolationist, you know. I mean, I think he believes that we can be biggest and best and not do any of those things that we used to do that were leading the world and retain kind of strength. And I guess we'll see. I would say that this issue, the isolationism and the perception of unreliability and unpredictability actually are very much continuations of how the world perceived us in the first term. I was on the international desk then, and I think that was a theme of our coverage. So that, more than some of the domestic things, feels more similar to the first term. I heard something on the radio the other day about that. It was about summer travel, and it was basically saying that there was a lot of the travel was people were still traveling, but not as much outside the country. I think the reasons for that were not political, but actually economics, money wise, whatever. But it's possible that that's part of why, like, I'm not we ran a story recently that about Israelis traveling abroad, confronting kind of their decreased reputation around the world and being harassed. I wonder if Americans, if they really are traveling less abroad, are not, that's part of why they're not focused on that, because they haven't actually experienced that, like, oh, you're from America, eyebrow raise, you know, sneer, etc. Thanks for the
I
tariff.
think that it's probably on a very minimal sample of a few people I met in the summer as American tourists whom I don't know. Very polite, very apologetic, we're not like, our image abroad type thing, seemed to be the message. Definitely not brash American, where's the nearest McDonald's kind of thing, sort of. But I think both you and I are not in a position to really know what the truth of the samples are and how it goes. But I think there's every chance that it's a combination of a variety of things,
Well, I
sort
mean, I
of.
think, I was talking with someone over the weekend about, you know, feel about the government of a place versus the people of a place, and whether or not the people of a place are sort of complicit based on their government. And look, the reality is that this has been a 50-50 country in terms of how elections are decided for a long time. That we've had most presidential elections have been pretty close for a long time. And so that means that nearly half the country does not feel they didn't vote for the president who's in office. There wasn't until now, and I would include probably both Trump terms, Biden and Obama in this. There wasn't as much of a like, that's not my president, or I'm not, and you imagine the person traveling abroad that they are either like very pro or very anti. I feel like, and that's where the polarization, it's not like it's new here in terms of we have different opinions about who should run the country. That's not new here. The extent of like you are living in a different reality, everything the other guy does is terrible, evil, suspect. That's what's new, and I think that is interesting how that would affect this issue of whether we care how we're perceived abroad or how we relate to our leadership when we are traveling abroad. I feel like that is of a different dynamic, that the idea of apologizing or whatever.
I think that what's changed, and this isn't American, this is happening in many places. It's just much more brutal by the looks of it for what's happening in America, is that no respect anymore for the losing side. I won, winner takes all. And the quality of
Right.
the politicians has become really disgusting. So that, before you were elected, so you could say all kinds of things during an election campaign, but then you govern. You all sit in committees, you all,
Right.
do the job. And the perception is that now that's not the case in the US. And increasingly it's becoming problematic in other places too. That, no, the reason, I don't know, take an example, I can't remember who I was talking to with what country it was. Most democracies do not have it either in their constitution or in their legal books that if you are a minister or a member of parliament and you are caught stealing, you have to resign, because it was a sort of accepted idea that that would be the case, that, sort of you would be an honest, and if you were caught out for being dishonest, this was, a shame upon you and you would resign. So you now have a lot of people who are in power who are up against, sort of legal systems, whether it was Trump, whether it's Netanyahu, whether it's in other countries, and they just have no problem at all.
Right. Well, and it's not just that people are rejecting that norm. It's that there's no trust in the system, right? So it's like this allegation is the product of a conspiracy, is the product of intervention by another country, is the product of and is has been politicized. Everything is, I mean, I'm not so naive to think that like everything hasn't always been politicized, but it's like the balance between, if you take like Watergate versus, the balance between here's the evidence of what actually happened, and then here's the political context, framing, motivation, aggression around it, versus the explanation of the people who are refusing to leave office after being caught in some corruption scandal. They make it seem like 90% politics and 10%
Yeah, yeah.
activity. I mean, recently when, just a couple of weeks ago, I think, or maybe it was even last week, there was this new move against John Bolton for um, having some classified information, having mishandled classified documents, I think. And during the news meeting, one of the leaders of the masthead said, can we point out in some story that virtually everyone seems to have done this exact thing. Like now we've got examples of both parties, many officials who have either taken documents with them or had the email server. That basically this does not seem to be an unusual thing. It's just become a politicized prosecution target, and it's being used as a weapon, a political weapon.
I think that there's a lot of that going on. And again, it's not the only country in which it's happening, but the lack of respect for the rule of law from the country that went around the world saying, rule of law
Yeah.
is what matters, I think is really what's probably surprising many people in one way or another. Let me ask you, though, something else. You're saying it's polarized, but it appears as though the Democratic Party in the US just is making no effort whatsoever to climb out of its defeat, understand why it lost, and change its ways.
I mean, I think that's a little unfair. I think it's making lots of efforts and hasn't yet cohered around, a strategy. So there is a lot of conversation here among Democratic consultants and analysts and politicians themselves about what went wrong in 24, what they should change. I think that in a way that is relatively typical of the Democratic Party, there's not consensus and not there's not really a mechanism for getting to, well, here's what we're going to do. But there's been a lot of things floated, and there's a lot of conversations about this very question, and we'll sort of see how that plays out. There's a shaking out of it, or whether there's a crowded primary. We have midterms coming up next year, and there's some elections this year. There's the New York mayoral race and a couple governors' races, and there's a lot of conversation about whether and how those like three big elections will be lessons for the country for Democrats or not. And so I think I don't think it's a lack of trying. I think it's maybe a lack of either hitting on a good idea or having mechanisms for rallying people around it.
I mean, I think that's very polite, if I may be so bold, because I see the same happening again in Europe, for example. You see a lot of where, again, you have the rise of right-wing parties, more nationalist parties, and, sort of the centre-left ones dithering, not quite sure what it is they're going to do. Even centre-right ones are sort of, don't know. It's as though they're not catching on that the context has changed, that the realities have changed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say two things about that. One is, you know, people who lean authoritarian are better at forcing decision and, like, this is how we're going to do it. Maybe. And the other thing I do think we need to be open to the possibility or the reality that, like, actually the center left message or the progressive message or whatever you want to call it is not resonating. Like, that it's not that they're not trying, it's that it's not working because people are not buying it. They don't like what they're selling. I think that it is, I think there are lots of true political analyses about why Donald Trump and other and Netanyahu and other right-wing leaders are succeeding right now that are sort of cynical and based on their particular political tactics, campaign tactics, personalities, etc. But we just shouldn't forget. And, in New York, the success of Zohran Mamdani is a really interesting lesson in this because Zohran Mamdani and Donald Trump have a big thing in common, which is that they focus their campaigns on affordability. And I think we just should not discount what does the electorate care about and who has a coherent message about that thing. And, some of what the electorate cares about may also be tinged with xenophobia or racism. A lot of places in Europe are really, really wound up, as is the United States, around immigration. And the person who successfully crafts a message around immigration is going to get traction on it.
The amazing thing about the US, just on that very, very specific point, let me just backtrack one thing. Mr. Ahmadani, for those of our listeners who don't know, was elected in the Democratic primary to be the Democratic candidate, the official Democratic candidate for the race to become the next mayor of New York, which is due in November, right?
Correct.
Right.
Typically, New York is a very, very Democratic city. So typically the Democratic primary is the decisive election here. It's in June, but that this year is a little bit different because both the incumbent mayor, Eric Adams, who's a Democrat, is launching an independent reelection campaign, and Andrew Cuomo, another Democrat and the former governor who lost to Mamdani in the primary, is also running an independent campaign. So we basically, right now at least, have 3 Democratic candidates having a sort of rematch in the fall.
And also to emphasize that Mr. Ahmadani is basically, from want of a better way of putting it, belongs to the progressive camp. So, in other words, he's very much advocating a much more justice-based.
Yeah, he identifies as a democratic socialist and is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. He is on the far left of the Democratic Party. He's Bernie Sanders, AOC, and his campaign has been really about, I mean, it's sort of 2 important things to know about his campaign in terms of what they might tell us about other places, although New York is a very sui generis place. One is it has been a lot about affordability, rent control, grocery prices, free buses, etc. Very left-wing ideas about affordability, but focused on day-to-day issues like how much childcare costs. And the second is he is 33 years old, and he ran an incredibly effective campaign through social media. So he has kind of blown up the conventional tactics that have succeeded in New York, which were union endorsements and kind of get out the vote work and TV ads and money. And Andrew Cuomo had all of those things on his side, and Mamdani managed to blow him away in the primary through TikTok and Instagram and very grassroots online efforts videos that were incredibly effective. So those are the 2 things that national Democrats, I think, are thinking about, even though they're whether it's a congressional district or a governor's race or whatever, it's not going to work exactly the same as New York. Those are 2 things that feel like worthy lessons that need to be applied everywhere.
Well, I think that there's, going back to your broader argument, though, and this again is true to so many what used to be centrist left or right parties in many parts of Europe, for sure, developed world. Instead of focusing on equality and on rights, they focus on justice. And justice ends up being very much identity politics. It very much ends up being about specific causes, which don't necessarily have everybody behind them. Whereas, as you yourself said, at the end of the day, it's about money. If people are poor, justice is not what drives them.
I mean, I think one of the more compelling, to me anyway, postmortems of the 2024 election is that the Democrats were too focused on identity issues versus sort of kitchen table issues, and that those were sort of elite coastal privilege issues, not kind of where the rubber meets the road for most people in the country. One person's, I mean, and that sort of cartoon version of this is like, we spent too much time talking about gender neutral bathrooms or trans women being able to play sports and not enough time talking about affordability. I mean, if you are trans or love someone who is, that is both an identity issue and a kitchen table issue, right? Like, will I get my hormone treatment or not? But I think that there's right, the question of, will my kid be able to live the American dream by, owning doing better than I did, or owning a home, or what kind of jobs will they get? Those are more universal day-to-day concerns for more people. And so I think that most political professionals, I think that the Democrats would do well to talk less about identity and more about economics and affordability. It is also clearly true that President Trump has managed to shift the conversation and to really redefine the culture wars. 5 years ago, every corporation, university, organization was very focused on DEI and what they could do to make the playing field more level for more different kinds of people. The idea of anti-racism was, big in most circles. And, we're 180 degrees from that today, where you see every organization stripping from its website any mention of DEI in order to
Yeah,
avoid being sued about it. So, and, just the creation of the villain of woke is a major accomplishment for the right in terms of redefining the cultural map.
absolutely. Of that, there's no doubt. Take me into your day to day, because I was speaking to somebody today who lives in Washington, D.C., and he was talking about the fact that there's roadblocks, that since troops have been deployed in Washington, D.C., which in itself is a mind-boggling concept. First in Los Angeles and then in D.C., deploying troops and
Yeah,
trying
I
to.
mean, I do think that in both DC and LA, from what I mean, I don't live in either of those places, but from what I can gather, in both cases, that it has been very sporadic and narrow. I mean, and one of the criticisms of the DC deployment is that the visible presence of the National Guard in particular was at like tourist sites and low crime neighborhoods, not actually where crime is a real problem. So I don't think it feels like, a under siege or, at war kind of situation, but I do think there's some amount of this is, clearly meant to be theater. I heard a really smart analyst on the radio this morning, where he made a really smart point because, there were some things that happened yesterday where Trump was talking about expanding the initiative of deploying National Guard to cities including Chicago and New Orleans. New Orleans has a Republican leader and was very welcoming of it, whereas Chicago has a Democratic leadership that has been very not in our, you will not come kind of thing. So the extent to which, is this politics or is this real, I think comes through. And what this analyst pointed out was that the governors of both Louisiana and Illinois have the National Guard available to them to
Absolutely.
deploy in their cities however they see fit anytime. And that if the New Orleans mayor and Louisiana governor thought New Orleans is in trouble, we need some help from the National Guard, they could just
Absolutely.
do it. And so the idea that they're instead waiting for Trump to do it and then welcoming it is part of the theater, I think. Or this guy
Very
said.
much part of theatre, and so much of it is theatre. Forgive me for asking all of these sort of is the US falling apart type questions, but sort of for a lot of
I mean,
people outside the US appears that it is.
I have to say, a colleague, my old colleague, Jim Vandehei, who I covered the 2004 presidential campaign with, and he went on to, he was at the Washington Post then, and then he went on to found Politico and then found Axios. And he wrote a column, I think yesterday or the day before, that was all about how it's not falling apart and everything's basically fine. And most people in America, are going about their day-to-day lives that are not super engaged in hating their neighbors or in dismantling democracy or anything, and that people should chill out. I certainly think it, I mean, people this summer went on vacation and went to the lake or the beach or whatever, and they're mostly doing their jobs and making dinner for their families and trying to, I play pickleball and, people are playing pickleball and doing whatever. So I certainly think it is true that most people, we are very, very lucky to, have um, these very significant oceans on our borders and no real threats to our day to day. And there's a lot of turmoil in the economy, but you know, it's not a famine or, it's we do have a lot. I think people are quite concerned when you do talk to them about the news, but most people do not obsess about the news. I will also say I saw a movie, I'm now forgetting the name of this movie, but it was incredible. It's a feature film, but based on a true story about Brazil in the 1970s and a congressman that was during the military junta, and the congressman is kidnapped and then murdered, and it's really about his family. Did you see this film?
I haven't seen it yet.
Okay, I will look up the name of the film. But what's kind of incredible about this film it's really, I really recommend it, which would be better if I knew the title of it. So we'll be Googling that in a second.
It'll be in the notes of this
Yes.
episode.
Okay. Thank you. Apologies. Anyway, the film opens with this beautiful scene in Rio. People are at the beach and they're playing volleyball, and there's like a dinner party. These are, well off people. Maybe it's Sao Paulo, not Rio. I don't know. Anyway, life is normal. And then the sort of teenage daughter of this family is going out with her friends, and they're stopped at a checkpoint. And then soon after this, the father, who's a member of Congress, is abducted. What was really like incredible to see is that contrast, and a reminder that when there's authoritarianism, it doesn't mean that like there's a lockdown, that life does go on as normal too, or in history that has happened, where you're having a dinner party, you're at the beach, and people are being stopped and searched at checkpoints or abducted at the like literally at the same time. And
Absolutely.
so I think, I'm not saying that we're in a military state, we're not, but there is a little bit of that split screen. I imagine that your friend from DC, like, yes, there was the roadblock, and then he went the other way and there was no roadblock, and he went to some cafe and had like a perfectly normal dinner. Like there's some weird.
Absolutely. Sort of, and the split screen effect, you see it everywhere. And you see it everywhere historically, as you say, sort of for good, for bad, for ill, sort of. I can't remember which film I was watching about Argentina in the 70s. And again, for a lot of people, it was everyday life, sort of. It's not necessarily about, and I can't remember the name of that film either, so I'm not going to
I
go
just
there.
got it. This film that I was talking about is called I'm Still Here.
Okay.
So that's the one I recommend.
Okay, so we will have that. We will have that in the notes, we promise. Jodi, we're going to move towards the end, but let me just ask you two questions more on the external issues. One of them is, what is perceived now as the enemy of the US from that point of view? Sort of as we started out and said, there was a certain withdrawal. Is China perceived as an enemy? Is Europe? What is the enemy?
I mean, that's a great question. And I really do think that there's at least two USs who would answer that. But I mean, I do think China has become the real like bugbear, the is increasingly perceived as a world villain slash threat. And there's a big story at the top of our website today that's about this hack that, you know, we did some investigation that shows that there's a certain hack that, China has, this company has the information about every single American or something like that. And I think from like a villain perspective, it's that, I would say a good part of America would also put Putin and Putin's Russia there, but certainly there's some real fracturing on the right over where Putin fits. I
Right.
don't think people think of Europe as the enemy.
Mm.
And I also would say that, the Trump supporting world, like, just sees the left as the enemy, the woke left, right? So I think that, like, that they, I think it's like that's part of Europe, but not all of Europe. It was interesting when Trump was, had all the leaders of Europe in the White House with Zelensky, right? And you see, the way the way the NATO chief has engaged him, and he's engaged the NATO chief. And what is the president of Norway that he like? Is it Norway? I forget. Norway, one of those guys. I can't remember. Um, so I think, it's not, I don't think it's like so big as Europe bad. I think there's
That could
pockets.
very well be. And, sort of one of the things that people are very conscious of on the outside is that, sort of this whole obsession with making Canada, part of the US. I'm saying this is a Trump obsession. This isn't an American obsession. And the whole Greenland story hasn't, as you can imagine, landed particularly well in Europe. Is that got any traction amongst the Trump voter?
I think for me, those two things are the great examples of what we talked about a lot in the first term, which is to take Trump seriously, but not literally. I don't think anybody thinks that this is like a policy proposal more than a rhetorical thing. I mean, he does keep coming back to it, so I don't want to discount it. I heard him talking about Greenland just the other day, but I don't. I feel like, and this relates to what you were saying about it's like there's this isolationism, but also this ego, confidence, strength thing. So I'm not going to engage in leading the world through these institutions like NATO that I think are s- stupid or beneath me, or we've been taken advantage of there, but I will continue to sort of strong arm the world. And so whether that leads, I think what Trump and his supporters would say is that the bombast has yielded results. I mean, when he talked about these like peace agreements that he's negotiated, these deals that he's made, I mean, I think they feel that that is an effective strategy to not work through diplomacy and organizations and channels, but to assert authority and threaten and strong arm people, and that's a different way of being a superpower, and that's sort of, but they would say it's effective.
Well, he hasn't actually negotiated practically anything, but hey ho, we can take one place after another. Jodi, we're just about to finish, but what do you think is lying ahead in the autumn? How do you see this last quarter of the year?
Well, I can't believe we haven't really talked about Israel Gaza, and I think that the situation there is
Correct.
particularly dire, and the situation for Israel's position in the world is particularly fragile right now. And we have the UN coming up. We've seen Israel's allies promise to recognize the Palestinian state at this year's General Assembly. I don't know what's going to happen in the fall, but the mix of what Netanyahu and the military ends up doing on the ground in Gaza, what happens with the famine in Gaza, and what happens with whether it's official actions like the UN or day-to-day interactions of people, and what happens with Israel's isolation. I think that that is a massive dynamic for the next little while. And then the other, I mean, the big thing that's happening kind of in the US, right, is that like all this stuff about what Trump's been doing is now working its way through the courts. And so you've seen just this week, there's been like a series of mid-court rulings against a bunch of Trump emergency actions. Most of those things will get appealed to the Supreme Court. So we'll see kind of how that all shakes out. One in particular that one storyline I'm really focused on in the US is Trump's particular war with higher education. This may be because I just sent 2 kids off to college this fall, but I think or because I'm a former education reporter, but I would say it's actually because it's where so many issues kind of collide. I mean, this question of free speech, the question of identity politics, the question of elite, the question of science, as you said. It is also the place maybe where America meets the world most, right? We have these huge numbers of international students who've historically come here and whose future here is somewhat threatened by this. So I think that's something to just keep watching as school's back in session now. Yeah, so
I think that's absolutely very correct. I would, of course, add that the situation in Ukraine is really bad. And, all that Trump somehow has managed to do is to, rather than negotiate anything, to increase the bombing on civilian targets constantly and to withdraw a lot of the aid that the US gave to, or promised to give to Ukraine, unless the Europeans pay for it, which they are doing in any case. So that wasn't much of an issue. But he's let Putin off the hook, and I don't see him getting him on the hook.
so if you had to pick which conflict, Ukraine, Russia, or Israel, Gaza, would be resolved first?
Israel Gaza.
Really? Okay.
I would say that largely because I think that the internal pressure in Israel on Netanyahu and his government is much stronger than anything that's happening either in Russia or in the US. I don't see people out in the street in the US trying to pressure their government to help Ukraine. And most people couldn't spell Russia if they fell over it backwards. So, yes, it's an historic thing and, we don't like them, but I think that the pressure mounting on the Israeli government is getting very severe. Again, he won't buckle quickly. And all the things you were mentioning that Netanyahu quite likes, isolationism, make Israelis feel under pressure, make them feel alone. So therefore they will turn to him or to more military activity. But I think that the pressure on the government and the inability of the government to carry on paying the ultra-Orthodox will result in the fall of this government. And there's already an election campaign, very subtle running. But he just wants to stay out of jail. But what we're really also looking at, in addition to that, would be, who's learning from who? Is it Trump learning from Netanyahu, Netanyahu learning from Erdogan, Erdogan learning from Orban, Orban learning from Modi? You look around the world and all of them, they've thrown Bolsonaro out of the club because, he failed. He didn't get reelected and he didn't manage to stage a coup. So, what the hell kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. And I would also say, like, let's, I mean, the various countries you named have various levels of democratic elections.
Absolutely.
But in several of them, where there are real elections, they have elected those people repeatedly. And
Yep.
so perhaps we just need to be really open to the idea that this is actually what that the world has shifted. It's not just the leaders.
That is a very unfortunate but very true point on which to end this wonderful conversation. I just sort of feel we should have brought 2 glasses of wine and really got into it, kind of thing. But hey ho, thank you so much, Jodi. That's a wrap on this
Thanks
episode
again
of
for
Women
having
Lead.
me.
Oh, it's been great. Anyway, so that's our wrap on this episode of Women Leaders. Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Watch us, of course, on our YouTube channel. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word of this episode to friends, colleagues, family, enemies, and anyone you think would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram as @women_leaders_podcast and on ELN Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All information and links mentioned in this episode, especially the film that Jodi couldn't remember and then she could remember. All information and links mentioned in this episode can be found in the notes. I'm Ilana Bet-El with my friend and producer, Florence Ferrando, and we'll be back very soon with another great conversation.